Come all ye gallant heroes, along with me combine. I'll sing a song, it won't take long, of the fight in '69. They're a band of men brave, stout and bold, from Ireland they came. And they have a leader to the fore, Mick Cochrane was his name. It was in the month of April when the boys they sailed away, and they made a sight so glorious as they marched along Broadway. They marched right down Broadway, me boys, until they reached the shore. And from there they went to Washington and straight on to the war. So we gave them hearty cheers, me boys, which was greeted with a smile, singing, here's the boys that fear no noise, we're the fight in '69. And when the war is said and done, may heaven spare our lives, for it's only then that we can return to our loved ones and our wives. We'll take them in our arms, me boys, for a long night and a day, and we'll hope that war will come no more to sweet America. So we gave them hearty cheers, me boys, which was greeted with a smile, singing, here's the boys who fear no noise, we're the fight in '69. So farewell unto you, dear New York, will I e'er see you?
We are very pleased to be associated with the New York Historical Society, who have restored a wonderful painting, The Return of the 69th, which honours the life of Thomas Francis Meagher.
Now it is calling us, and we must hasten.
Could you tell me on how you actually came across the life of Thomas Francis Meagher, and what impact did it make upon you when you discovered about all these adventures and achievements in America?
When we bought the hotel, which is named the Granville, there was a plaque outside it which says Thomas Francis Meagher. So we were interested then to know who this man was. So when we did some research into it, he was born actually in this building here in 1823 and has a very interesting and exciting life. So we followed up on all of that.
So you began your research on Thomas Francis Meagher. Where did you actually look in terms of libraries or museums to find out about his life?
Well, at the start we were very busy because we had to knock the building more or less and rebuild it because it was it was like a tenement really. So I got a local historian at the time to do some research for me, and he did up a booklet for us on Thomas Francis Meagher, which, you know, introduced us really very well to him.
Was there any artifacts in the house from Meagher's life, or did you have to go searching in libraries or various museums to find out about his life?
Yeah, no, there was nothing here except just one painting or print, which is actually signed by Thomas Francis Meagher in 1848, which is interesting because I think it may have been done when he was arrested in jail. But it's a very interesting one. We have that. That's the only thing we had. Everything else we just had to research and look into.
Your connection then, when you went to America with the state of Montana, I believe that you journeyed to Montana to uncover more of the connections with Meagher and his life in Ireland. Could you tell me about that visit to Montana?
I went to America to New York actually with a delegation from Waterford because we were actually twinned with Rochester, New York, and hadn't thought of going any further than there. But whilst I was there, I decided, you know, I should go and see where Thomas Francis Meagher died. So I decided to go for to San Francisco, where I had a friend, and then she organised with the Irish consulate in San Francisco to go to Helena in Montana. So when I went to Helena in Montana, I met the Secretary of State. At the time, it was 1988, and Mike Cooney. And he actually made me an honorary Secretary of State of Montana, which was quite fascinating. But I found the whole experience was so emotional, really, you know, to think I just had such comfort flying and just getting there so easily. And Thomas Francis Meagher had to go on horse and boat, and terrible hardship as well as that. No phones, no communication or anything. So it was just awe-inspiring and totally emotional as well.
The fate of Thomas Francis Meagher, you have certain views on his death. What would your view be on?
I read a very interesting book that my husband was given. It was by Captain Lyons, who wrote it in 1869, which was just 2 years after Thomas Francis Meagher died. And he has a letter from the captain of the paddle steamer, who was friendly with Thomas Francis Meagher, because apparently he had brought Elizabeth Meagher up from New York to Montana, to Fort Benton, just a few months previous. So he was very friendly with Thomas Francis Meagher. And Thomas Francis Meagher stayed on the boat that night. And he hadn't been well. He'd had dysentery for about 6 days. He'd been doing a lot of travelling. So he went to bed early. And the next thing, they heard a few shouts. And when the captain of the boat checked the room, no sign of Thomas Francis Meagher. So they assumed then he had actually fallen into the river. Now, he thought that he had tripped over a rope, but there's various other stories, you know, that he might have been killed or bumped off, but his body was never found, so they just really don't know what happened to him. But his wife would have been in Helena at that time, and that was in Fort Benton.
So I believe Meagher was the man who actually organised the Fighting 69, the Irish Brigade.
Well, the Irish Brigade, the Fighting 69 were already there. They were a regiment that he joined initially. But after the first Battle of Bull Run, which was the first battle in the Civil War in 1861, he saw there were so many Irish people in other regiments as well. He decided to form a completely Irish regiment, just with Irish men. And he formed the Irish Brigade, which was very famous.
So obviously he was a friend of the President, Abraham Lincoln.
Yes, he must have been, because Abraham Lincoln appointed him as the acting Secretary of State of Montana, which was a territory at that time. And then when Abraham Lincoln died, he was actually one of the pallbearers at the funeral, which meant that he must have held him in very high esteem, really.
Could you explain to me the legacy of Thomas Francis Meagher and how people view Thomas Francis Meagher in the context of Irish and American history?
There are two factions, I suppose, with anybody famous. There's generally people who love them or hate them. So whilst Thomas Francis Meagher was really loved and admired and respected by so many people, there were people also that really disliked him and despised him. And whether they had any reason or whether it was just political or what, I think it's very hard to know, because all his life he was very honest and upright and a total gentleman.
So I believe Meagher was a Democrat, so did he have a lot of enemies in the Republican Party? Or?
Well, maybe he had, you know, I don't know. And I think a lot of even Irish people in America at the time, when he encouraged people to fight in the Civil War, because that Abraham Lincoln was the president at the time, and I think they thought, you know, he was jumping ship, really. But he felt, because in America, he felt there was so much freedom and that everybody had a right to freedom. And that we as Irish people, because we were so kept down under British rule here, that everybody should join in the Civil War and fight for freedom for everybody.
Today we're actually at the Bishop's Palace Museum with the curator Donncha O'Callaghan, and he's going to explain to us the connection with Daniel O'Connell, Thomas Francis Meagher and the Waterford family that supported O'Connell in his campaigns.
It's significant in a way that Daniel O'Connell, who's known as the liberator in Ireland, the man who achieved Catholic emancipation or the right of Catholics to sit in the British House of Commons, he began his political campaign here in Waterford in 1826. Very much with the support of a local man, Thomas Meagher, who was the father of Thomas Francis Meagher, the Civil War general. Thomas Meagher was born in Newfoundland, born in St. John's, and relocated to Waterford back in the early 19th century. He would have been the equivalent, I suppose, of a self-made millionaire, fabulously wealthy man, businessman and philanthropist here in the city. Very much a supporter of O'Connell and O'Connell's tactics and O'Connell's ideas. And in the very first outing, I suppose, of O'Connell in 1826, when he won a crucial by-election here in Waterford, it was Thomas Meagher, who essentially bankrolled that campaign and supported him right throughout. I suppose Thomas Meagher would have been very much involved in that O'Connell style of politics. First of all, in the struggle for Catholic emancipation, which was successful. After that, then, of course, the campaign for repeal of the Act of Union, in other words, to re-establish the old Irish Parliament, which had been abolished in 1801. Thomas Meagher, an interesting character, a very significant character in his own right. The man, for example, who was the first Catholic mayor of Waterford since the 17th century, elected in 1843. After that, Member of Parliament for Waterford from 1847 on, but a firm supporter of O'Connell and O'Connell's campaigns right throughout his political life. When young Thomas Francis Meagher, who had been educated in England, one of the great English public schools, Stonyhurst, a Jesuit Catholic school, when he returned here to Waterford, he would have been one of that new generation of politicians, to a certain extent, who entered into O'Connell, who became part of O'Connell's movement. And by then, of course, O'Connell, as the leader of the movement, was seen by many as getting old, getting tired, perhaps not quite up to the job of achieving the repeal of the Act of Union and independence for Ireland. So, as happens in a lot of political movements, the young tigers, to a certain extent, were vying with each other, looking at the leadership, and I suppose trying to edge out the older generation of Thomas Meagher Sr., for example, and Daniel O'Connell. And in fact, Thomas Francis Meagher would have clashed with his father on many occasions over the tactics being employed by O'Connell. By the 1840s, people like Thomas Francis Meagher would have seen O'Connell's tactics as having essentially failed in achieving repeal of the Act of Union, independence for Ireland, and believed that O'Connell had been effectively outmanoeuvred by the British government, and that his style of sort of pacifism and a non-violent campaign would essentially not succeed. Daniel O'Connell would have based his campaign on this sort of the idea that a rational moral approach towards the problems of Ireland, in being able to mobilise, for example, vast numbers of people to support his campaign. He believed that that alone would be enough to put pressure on the British government to realise that Ireland's future lay with an independent parliament. However, it did not succeed. And again, Thomas Francis Meagher would have seen the fact that because O'Connell would not use the threat of physical force, the British government would essentially ignore his campaign and could sidestep him. And I suppose that's essentially what did happen. So Thomas Francis Meagher, I suppose, and a number of others too within the O'Connell's movement, that younger generation, believed that there was an extra step needed, I suppose, to achieve independence. That step into violence, or the threat of violence, that O'Connell was not prepared to take.
Conciliation Hall in Dublin, was that a political meeting house of the Irish Nationalists?
Yes, that was the headquarters essentially of O'Connell's movement, and that's where some of the great meetings were held, where the great debates of the day took place, and that's essentially where Thomas Francis Meagher made his famous sword speech, where he vehemently disagreed with O'Connell's tactics and laid down a marker, really. It was an attempt, I suppose, by that younger generation to move perhaps the political leaders like O'Connell to one side.
What political leaders was more involved with? It was the Young Fenians?
Well, it would have been the Young Ireland, or the Young Ireland movement as such, which would have been essentially like I won't say exactly a youth wing of the movement, but been a younger generation of intellectuals, a number of them who were Protestants, people like Gavin Duffy, Mitchell, etc., who saw perhaps Ireland going in a different direction. And Marr himself and a number of these were caught up in, especially as well, in that revolutionary movement which spread throughout Europe in 1848, when you had revolutions in France and in Prussia, in Austria and in the Papal States as well, and saw himself as part of that. I suppose it was in that context where he designed our national flag of green, white and orange. And also it was in that context that he saw that the tactics of O'Connell were not going to succeed.
When he went to America, he did become a military figure. He was involved in the Civil War and the campaign and the fighting 69. Maybe you could explain a bit more about that.
To explain how he got to America, Marr was sentenced to be hung, drawn and quartered for his roles in what was viewed as sedition from the English crown. He was banished, the sentence was commuted to life banishment in Tasmania. He escaped from Tasmania and made his way to America to rapturous applause and welcome from the Irish community in New York. At the onset of the American Civil War, Marr was very prominent in calling to the Irish people to answer the call to the Union side. He believed it would be hypocritical for the Irish not to fight for the Union. The way he looked at it was, how could they abhor the horrible treatment the Irish had within Ireland? How could they not try and bring those principles to the States? Marr was instrumental in the raising of the Irish Brigade. The descendants today are the modern fighting 69th, which are still active today in New York. The Irish Brigade was fought in all the major conflicts of the American Civil War. They fought in some of the bloodiest battles of the American Civil War. They won praise from both sides for the courage and the bravery that they showed in all the battles of the American Civil War. As I said, the descendants of that brigade exist today, which are the fighting 69th. The battle flags that the Irish Brigade had obtained within the American Civil War hang today in the Irish Dáil. They're presented by President John F. Kennedy in 1963, and they detail the actions that the brigade took part in within the American Civil War. So they played a massive role. The most famous ones would be battles like Fredericksburg, Antietam, which is also known as Bloody Lane. They saved the Union Army from rout in some of the earlier battles in the American Civil War. At the first Battle of Bull Run, which was called by the Confederate side the Battle of Manassas. But the most well-known battles would be Antietam, Fredericksburg, Gettysburg.
Today, the Fighting 69 still have a headquarters in New York. What do they do today as an army group? Are they active?
They are very active. They're a National Guard unit. We had representatives of the unit here in March for a celebration based around the life of Thomas Francis Marr.
Good to see you here today. Thank you for coming. Welcome to the Mall. The Barry Street Concert Band was conducted by Mark Fitzgerald. We have a big round of applause for their playing here this afternoon. Thank you. Well done, everyone. In 2010, they celebrated 140 years of unbroken service here in Waterford. You're very welcome to this very special occasion here today. We're both celebrating an historic event.
Here he comes, being led by the Naval Service. Thomas Francis Marr, as he would have looked at the time. This is the ceremonial jacket. Very, very impressive.
And he would have walked this mall many times as a young man, of course, being educated in some of the finest schools in Ireland, Clongowes Wood included, and also in Trinity College, Dublin as well.
He will shortly be making a speech, and one of the things to note about Thomas Francis Marr is when he went to England, his accent actually changed quite considerably, I believe. So I'd be interested to hear what he sounds like shortly, because he was ribbed for his rather English accent.
Well done, Brad. Hard. P.
Thomas Francis Marr, he has just received the flag from the Mayor of Saint-Herblain, Monsieur Charles Gauthier.
From France, this tricolour has been proudly borne. I present it to my native land and trust that my country will once again accept this symbol of a new life from one of her children.
On the 9th of July, 1849, an order for the deportation of 4 prisoners to Australia, the penal colony of Tasmania, or Van Diemen's Land as it was then known, arrived at Richmond Prison in Dublin. Among the prisoners was a young Waterford man, Thomas Francis Marr. 1849 was indeed a dark year for Marr personally and for Ireland. Having narrowly escaped the death penalty for his involvement in the failed 1848 rebellion, he was, at 26 years of age, facing a very uncertain future: transportation from his native land for the rest of his life.
Today we're at the Bishop's Palace Museum with Eamon McEnany, the current director of the museum. Could you explain to me the importance of the artefacts that you have here on Thomas Francis Marr?
The Bishop's Palace Museum deals with the history of Waterford from 1700 up to 1970, so it's done in date-wise in chronological order. And one of the rooms here is called the Marr Room. It's dedicated to the period in the 19th century when Thomas Francis Marr and his father were hugely influential in the history of the city. And Daniel O'Connell, of course, was Member of Parliament for the city. And in the basic part of the collection here has to do with material that Thomas Francis Marr's widow sent back to Waterford in 1886, and there's huge celebrations when these objects are sent here. They built kind of triumphal arches and the bands playing and all the rest of it. And that includes two of his swords from the American Civil War, his American Army swords, a sash from his American Army uniform, a painting of him in his American Army uniform as a Brigadier General by an Irish artist but who lived in New York, and a sprig of green that from one of the battles, either Antietam or Fredericksburg or Bull Run, that he told the Irish apparently to wear sprigs of green, and this is his sprig of green from one of those battles. We don't know which battle it is exactly, but just something obviously his wife treasured, and then when she became his widow she obviously kept it but thought it was better in Waterford, so she sent it back here. We also have a letter that was donated to us by a collector here about a year ago, Senator Mark Daly, and that letter is hugely important. It's the last letter he wrote in Ireland before being transported to Tasmania, which is off Australia, where it was the penal colony that the British government, of course, transported him to. He wasn't executed for his part in the rebellion, even though the courts deemed that he should be, but being middle class, his sentence commuted to exile. And he wrote this letter in Dublin, in Richmond, from Richmond Prison, and it's a hugely poignant letter because you must remember when he wrote it in the summer of 1849, the country was in, of course, the worst grips of famine, starvation, mass emigration, mass starvation, and he's been in prison, of course, for his part or the role that in organising the 1848 rebellion. And in it, what he says, given that the country was probably at the lowest ebb it has ever been in its history, horrendously bad weather, the rebellion had failed, people starving, and it's absolutely the most positive and uplifting letter you could read. He talks about great nations, about the ancient Greek civilization and the ancient Roman civilization, how great civilizations don't fall away, and he's kind of looking forward to a time in the future when Ireland would become a great republic and basically emulate the success of the United States of America in becoming the great republic at the other side of the Atlantic. And it's absolutely one of the most uplifting letters you could read. In fact, when we got the letter, it was in 2008, just after the whole banking system had crashed and the recession had begun here in Ireland. And I remember after receiving the letter, there's a beautiful sentence in it about how Ireland will rise again and there'll be triumphal arches. And I took those few words and I sent them off to the Irish Times, and they printed the letter just, I think, as a way of having some good news to give to the Irish people that we've been here before and we got through it, and we'll be here again maybe. Do the same, make the same silly mistakes, but at least it was an uplifting thing that things would improve.
So we gave them hearty cheers, me boys, which was greeted with a smile, singing here's the boys that fear no noise, we're the fighting 69. And when the war is said and done, may heaven spare our lives, for it's only then that we can return to our loved ones and our wives. We'll take them in our arms, me boys, for a long night and a day. And we'll hope that war will come no more to sweet America. So we gave them hearty cheers, me boys, which was greeted with a smile. Singing, here's the boys who fear no lies, we're the fighting 69. So farewell unto you, dear New York, will I e'er see you once more? For it fills my heart with sorrow to leave your sylvan shore. But the country now it is calling us, and we must hasten for. So here's to the stars and stripes, me boys, and to Ireland's lovely shore.